The collapse never begins with explosions. It never arrives announced by sirens or marching armies. Most of the time, it begins with silence. A report quietly altered before publication. A scientist ignored during a late-night meeting. A government spokesman standing beneath bright lights, speaking calmly, while the foundations of an entire society begin to crack beneath the surface. History remembers the disasters themselves, but rarely the long period before them. The slow denial, the carefully constructed illusions, the desperate refusal to confront reality while there was still time to act. Across centuries and continents, governments have faced moments when truth became politically dangerous. And again, leaders chose not to solve the crisis, but to deny its existence. Entire civilizations would continue moving forward like sleepwalkers, surrounded by warning signs no one in power wanted to acknowledge. By the time ordinary people understood what was happening, the machinery of collapse was already in motion. In the final years before the fall of many great states, daily life often appeared strangely normal. Markets remained open, children continued attending school, newspapers printed patriotic headlines designed to reassure the population that everything was under control. In imperial capitals, officials attended banquets beneath chandeliers, while economic systems quietly rotted underneath them. In rural regions, crops failed year after year while local authorities manipulated records to avoid punishment from higher offices. Reality became something negotiated rather than observed. The most dangerous phase of collapse was not the disaster itself, but the period when institutions became incapable of admitting the truth. Ancient Rome experienced this paralysis during periods of financial decay and political fragmentation. Centuries later, the Soviet Union would face similar patterns, constructing massive bureaucratic illusions, while shortages spread across the nation. But no one understood what was coming next, because the state itself had become dependent on denial for survival. The human mind has always struggled to accept gradual catastrophe. Governments, however, possess an even deeper vulnerability. Entire political systems are often built upon narratives of strength, stability, and inevitability. To admit weakness is to risk panic. To acknowledge failure is to threaten legitimacy itself. During the final decades of the Qing dynasty in China, officials repeatedly minimized internal unrest and foreign pressure, believing public acknowledgement would accelerate instability. In France before the revolution, financial collapse approached like an invisible tide, while royal authorities insisted the monarchy remain secure. By the time emergency reforms were finally attempted, public trust had already evaporated. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly, inside meeting rooms filled with men who believed reality could be postponed through confidence alone. But reality has always moved independently of political language. It advances slowly, patiently, until denial itself becomes one of the forces accelerating destruction. Sometimes the warnings came from nature itself: droughts, failed harvests, spreading disease, poisoned rivers, changing climates. Yet governments repeatedly transformed environmental crises into political problems rather than existential ones. During the Soviet handling of the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, authorities delayed public warnings even as radioactive contamination spread invisibly across cities and countryside. Families continued attending parades beneath toxic air because the state feared the appearance of weakness more than the danger itself. Similar patterns emerged during famines throughout history. Local officials concealed food shortages to protect careers. Central governments manipulated production statistics to preserve the illusion of success. Entire populations starved while official reports described stability and growth. The terrifying aspect of systemic denial is not simply dishonesty. It is the creation of an alternate reality powerful enough to delay action until solutions no longer exist. By the time the signs became clear, it was already too late to reverse the damage already unfolding beneath the surface. Inside authoritarian systems, denial often became self-reinforcing. Lower officials feared reporting bad news upward. Leaders surrounded themselves with carefully filtered information, designed to confirm existing beliefs. Truth slowly disappeared from the structure itself. During the final years of Nazi Germany, military commanders increasingly provided distorted assessments of battlefield conditions, unwilling to confront Adolf Hitler with the scale of impending defeat. Maps inside command centers continued showing imaginary divisions that no longer existed. Entire strategies were developed around fantasies maintained through fear and obedience. But democratic societies were not immune to similar failures. During economic collapses and public health crises, elected governments also minimized dangers to protect markets, elections, or political reputations. The mechanisms differed, but the psychology remained remarkably consistent. Governments often feared the consequences of telling the truth more than the consequences of the disaster itself. And in that hesitation, collapse gained momentum, quietly at first, then all at once. For ordinary people, the transition from stability to breakdown rarely felt immediate. It unfolded through small disruptions that gradually altered daily life. Prices rose slightly faster each month. Supplies became harder to find. Rumors spread through crowded streets and factory lines. Confidence eroded invisibly before institutions physically collapsed. In the Weimar Republic during the hyperinflation crisis of the 1920s, citizens watched savings accumulated across entire lifetimes become worthless almost overnight. Yet even during the early stages, many officials insisted recovery was close. Public reassurance became detached from lived experience. This separation between official narratives and personal reality created something profoundly dangerous: distrust. Once populations begin believing institutions are incapable of acknowledging truth, social cohesion starts to fracture. Conspiracy replaces confidence, fear replaces routine, communities retreat inward, and governments, instead of rebuilding trust through honesty, often respond by tightening control, suppressing criticism and punishing dissent, accelerating the very instability they hope to avoid. Some governments denied military realities until destruction stood at their doorstep. Imperial Japan during the final phase of World War II continued projecting confidence to civilians, while entire cities burned beneath relentless bombing campaigns. Citizens were instructed to prepare for victory even as food shortages intensified and infrastructure collapsed. Similar scenes unfolded inside collapsing empires throughout history. Political elites often became psychologically trapped inside narratives they had spent years constructing. To reverse course publicly meant admitting catastrophic misjudgment, and so denial continued, even while reality consumed the state from within. The terrifying lesson repeated across centuries is that collapse becomes far more dangerous when leaders mistake optimism for strategy. Hope detached from evidence becomes paralysis. Entire governments can become prisoners of their own propaganda. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens continue waking each morning, attempting to preserve fragments of normal life, unaware they are living inside the final chapter of a system already beginning to disintegrate. Disease has repeatedly exposed the lethal consequences of institutional denial. During outbreaks throughout history, governments often suppressed information to avoid economic disruption or public panic. In medieval cities facing plague, authorities delayed quarantines because trade needed to continue. During the early stages of multiple 20th century epidemics, officials minimized infection rates while hospitals quietly filled beyond capacity. The pattern remained hauntingly familiar: first reassurance, then confusion, then sudden emergency measures once the crisis became impossible to conceal. But epidemics reveal something deeper about political systems. They expose whether institutions are capable of adapting reality into policy quickly enough to survive. When leaders prioritize appearances over evidence, the delay itself becomes catastrophic. Viruses spread silently during hesitation. Fear multiplies faster than official statements. And once public trust disappears during a health crisis, even truthful information begins losing effectiveness. Governments that denied reality often discovered too late that reality itself does not negotiate with political necessity. Economic collapse followed similar trajectories. Financial systems depended heavily on collective belief, and governments frequently feared that honesty would trigger panic capable of accelerating disaster. During the Great Depression, banks failed in waves while many leaders initially described the crisis as temporary. In Argentina's economic collapses, in Zimbabwe's hyperinflation, in countless debt crises across history, official reassurances persisted long after ordinary citizens sensed something profoundly wrong. Lines formed outside banks, factories closed, currency lost meaning. Yet public statements continued speaking the language of stability. The collapse did not begin with empty shelves. It began the moment institutions stopped accurately describing conditions to the people depending on them. Once trust collapses inside an economy, recovery becomes exponentially harder. Markets can survive hardship, societies can endure sacrifice, but systems built upon shared beliefs struggle to survive sustained dishonesty. The invisible contract between government and population begins dissolving, and without that contract, stability becomes impossible to maintain. Technology eventually amplified the speed of denial and collapse alike. In earlier centuries, governments could suppress information for months or years. Modern communication shattered that barrier. During disasters, wars, and political crises, contradictory realities now spread simultaneously across digital networks. Governments attempting to deny visible conditions faced a new enemy: millions of witnesses. Yet paradoxically, the information age also created new forms of denial. Truth became fragmented beneath floods of propaganda, misinformation, and algorithmic manipulation. Citizens no longer knew which version of reality to trust. Some governments exploited this confusion deliberately, understanding that overwhelming populations with conflicting narratives could paralyze collective action. The result was not always belief in official lies, but exhaustion itself. A population unable to distinguish truth from fiction becomes vulnerable to manipulation, apathy, and fear. And in moments of systemic crisis, confusion can be as destructive as censorship. The collapse of shared reality often arrives before the collapse of institutions themselves. History repeatedly demonstrates that governments rarely intend to destroy their societies. Most denials emerge from fear, political pressure, institutional inertia, or the desperate hope that problems might somehow resolve themselves. Yet systems built upon avoidance accumulate fragility over time. Infrastructure weakens, trust erodes, expertise is ignored. Reality continues advancing while institutions remain trapped defending outdated narratives. In the final years before collapse, many leaders genuinely believed they were preserving stability through reassurance. But reassurance without action becomes dangerous. Every delayed response narrows the path toward recovery. Every suppressed warning transforms manageable crises into irreversible ones. And eventually, the gap between official reality and lived reality becomes too large to sustain. When that moment arrives, collapse often appears sudden to the outside world. But beneath the surface, the breakdown had been unfolding for years, hidden beneath speeches, ceremonies, statistics, and carefully controlled narratives, designed to preserve the illusion that control still existed. The most haunting aspect of these collapses is how ordinary they often looked from the inside. People still celebrated birthdays, couples still married, workers still boarded trains each morning while governments around them quietly lost the ability to function honestly. History is filled with populations who sensed something was wrong, but lacked the information, power, or unity necessary to change the course unfolding around them. Some adapted, some resisted, many simply endured. And long after the governments themselves disappeared, the consequences remained carved into generations. Economic scars, cultural trauma, political extremism, shattered trust in institutions. The ruins left behind were not only physical. Entire societies emerged psychologically altered by prolonged exposure to denial. Once populations witness reality being openly manipulated by those in power, the relationship between citizens and authority rarely returns unchanged. In the end, governments that denied reality were not destroyed by truth itself. They were destroyed by delay, by hesitation, by the refusal to confront problems while solutions still existed. History does not punish societies for facing crises. Every civilization encounters disasters, uncertainty, and instability. What history punishes is the inability to perceive reality clearly when survival depends on it. Across empires, republics, monarchies, and modern states, the pattern remains disturbingly consistent. Collapse rarely announces itself dramatically at first. It enters quietly through denial, through fear of public reaction, through institutions prioritizing appearances over adaptation. And when the moment finally arrives that truth can no longer be hidden, the system often discovers it has already exhausted the time needed to save itself. The silence before collapse is rarely empty. It is filled with warnings that no one in power was willing to hear.